Saint Luke, also known as Luke the Evangelist, is one of the four authors of the New Testament Gospels. He is traditionally believed to be a physician and a companion of Saint Paul. Saint Luke is credited with writing the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, which provides a two-part account of the life of Jesus and the early Christian church. The Gospel of Luke emphasizes compassion, forgiveness, and the inclusion of marginalized groups. In this series, Father Benoit Standaert unpacks the writings of Saint Luke, bringing to us a greater understanding of this evangelist and his writings. As we approach Advent, this series would be instrumental in our preparation for the Gospel according to Saint Luke.
Our help is in the name of the Lord, who made heaven and earth. All the best to you who follow this series of exchange and comments on the Gospel of Luke. Today I would like to introduce you in the two first chapters, what is called generally the Infancy Gospel of Luke. In the New Testament we have only two such infancy Gospels. But Luke is the largest. He's really surprising. He has more than 130 verses. And two long chapters. The first one has 80 verses. If we compare that with Matthew, Matthew has also two chapters, but they are teeny little in comparison with Luke. He starts with the genealogy of Jesus, and that takes more or less 1/3, even more than 1/3 of all what he has to say about childhood and birth of Jesus, the infancy. The real narrative is only 30 verses in Matthew. That means that Luke has at least 4 times the length of the narrative of Matthew. They have some information in common, which must be all the traditions that both knew, but there is no pericope that you can really directly compare between the two as such. It is best possible that Luke knew about Matthew. It is less evident that Matthew knew anything of what Luke had written. He wrote earlier. Anyhow, how do we can face this long story of 132 verses in the beginning of the Gospel of Luke? First observation, the Gospel starts in the temple. If I may speak in terms of cinema, he has put his camera already inside the temple in the part that only the sons of Aaron have the right to sit there or to enter. And there he has a vision with an older man, Zachariah. He has the vision of an angel and receives a complete message. That is the very beginning of the Gospel, in the temple and in the heart of the temple of Jerusalem. Well, this is original for Luke. And his Gospel will finish in the temple. The last verse of the last chapter, 24:53, he says they were constantly in the temple, praying and praising God. They that were the disciples after the first ascension of Jesus. And that makes the unity of the book. from the temple to the temple, from Jerusalem to Jerusalem. So he starts, and with an angel. Later on, we hear that it is Gabriel. And the second episode is 6 months later, in a totally other place, in Nazareth, a little village that in the rest of the Bible you never find, except in the New Testament. But in whole the Old Testament, nobody knows about Nazareth. Everybody knows about the temple. Everybody knows about the priests. Everybody knows about the high moment of the selection where Zacharias got the right to enter and then to pronounce the benediction at the end. So you see the contrast between someone very distinguished on a very distinguished place, and here in Nazareth to see someone we don't hear even the family of Mary. We don't know her genealogy in the Gospel of Luke. And she receives a message. And we see the symmetry. The same angel, both receive a message, and both will have to assume the newness. Zachariah has doubts and will become mute. Mary has faith and will proclaim her faith a bit later. But the story just starts first in the temple and then in Nazareth in Galilee. And that will be the structure of the whole book. In these 2 chapters, we will come back several times to Galilee and several times to Jerusalem. And the whole book, from chapter 3 on until the end, is Galilee and slowly over Samaria, go back to Jerusalem, and finally all the heavy happenings of death and resurrection will be concentrated in Jerusalem in the middle of the 2 books. As you remember, I said Luke has written 1 book in 2 volumes, and the middle of the 2 volumes is Christ risen in ascension. He comes back at the beginning of the Acts, and then the definitive ascension will happen. So it's a kind of mystery. Between the 2 books, there is a silence. There is an absence. There is a Christ who has made a first time an ascension and will do a definitive ascension at the beginning of the Acts. It's mysterious and beautiful. Christ taken away in prayer, in blessing, that is the last verb that we hear about him when he starts the ascension at the end of the book of the Gospel. Anyhow, we have here a model. We will come back on that for the topography of the Gospel. But in the vision of Luke, Jerusalem is the city of the fulfillment of all promises. And therefore he will concentrate his 2 books around Jerusalem, the end point also of the first book and the starting point of the second book, or the second volume of his 1 book, and starting in Jerusalem in waves. He will go on until the end of the world, and Rome is a bit the symbol of the pagan world until the place that Paul will join, and where he also, we know, but that's not in the narrative of Luke, where he will find his death and accomplishment. A second point that is original in the beginning is that not only we have a comparison between John and Jesus with parallel stories, but they are family of one another. They are cousins. And never in the public life of Jesus and John there is any reference to that. And we still question, but when did Luke knew that, and how historically true is that? In any case, it is in this infancy gospel that we see the two boys starting their life with a difference of 6 months, and that will continue after that. It remains strange that there is no mention at all of this link in the public life of John and Jesus, even if they meet one another and that Jesus has believed his whole life in the role and the mission, the prophetical mission of John the Baptist. Another element that is curious in these 2 chapters is that we get 3 psalms inserted in the narrative, new compositions on the lips of Mary, of Zachariah, and of Simeon. We see also in the temple that the old widow Hannah is praying, but we don't hear what she says. Instead, the other Hannah, the mother of Samuel, at the beginning of the books of the Kings and of Samuel, she composed a poetry that inspired directly the composition of the Magnificat of Mary. Those poetries, we get them separated in our liturgy, out of the context. But if we read them back in the context, they have a function. They open the narrative on perspectives in the future of Mary, the future of Jesus, the future of John the Baptist, even the future of all nations who will be, and all generations who will be concerned, and is the future also of the reader. They have a prophetical function. They are not just poetry and intimacy of praying life, they are also prophecy. They announce what in the rest of the book, and not only first part, but also the second volume, will be described. And that makes those texts very strong, very intense. And when you keep them in mind, you find them back during the Acts of the Apostles until the last page. What Simeon is saying in a few verses about Jesus will be repeated with the same vocabulary at the end of the Acts of the Apostles. And that's the talent of writing of our Luke, that he keeps that in mind and he repeats those elements, and this forms together a message for all, even for the extremity of the world, in the prison of Paul in Rome. We know those 3 canticles, hymns, rather good, because in the Latin liturgy we pray them every day. In the morning, in the evening, and then in couplets before going to sleep, we repeat the canticle of Simeon. This shows a great fidelity to the vision of Luke in our church. Now let us look a little bit more concentrated on the composition of the 2 chapters. I already mentioned the beginning in the temple. And the contrast then 6 months later in Nazareth, a priest of the caste of Aaron, and an anonymous little girl of a village in the north of the country in Galilee. Contrast in importance, but the message is the important figure is the one who comes after John. That is the whole message of these 2 chapters. Now, after these 2 presentations, and of Zacharias and of Mary, they knew nothing about one another. But at the end, the same angel is saying to Mary, Elizabeth, your parent, is pregnant and is already at her 6th month. Nothing is impossible, because she was not at all fertile, and she got a child. And so, with these last words of the angel, we prepare the encounter, and that is the 3rd element of the narrative, the meeting between the 2 pregnant women, Elizabeth at home and Mary greeting Elizabeth, and in the greeting, the child in the womb of Elizabeth is reacting to the voice of Mary. And Elizabeth is capable of understanding that Mary is pregnant of the Lord, the coming, the expected. And it will finish in a kind of praise of who is Mary with her faith, and then Mary itself with the canticle where she praised God. It's an interesting poem because she never addressed herself to God. It is a prayer without vocative, without second person, you, God. No, she says to the others, He has done this and He has done that. It's all the works and the acts of God that she praises in her canticle. Beautiful and concise, with allusions, especially also allusions to the canticle of Hannah, the mother of Samuel. These are the 3 elements with whom everything started. And then we will have the birth of John and the birth of Jesus. That is the real center of the whole infancy gospel of Luke. The symmetry is striking, evident, but there is a subtle difference between the 2. From the first, the birth is only 2 verses, very short. And immediately after, a week later, the family comes together and other friends for the circumcision. And at that moment, John will receive his name. The name was already given before his birth. And Elizabeth speaks first, and then finally Zacharias will speak, and he will find back the capacity to speak. He was made mute because of his unbelief. And we get a splendid oracle, the longest of the 3 canticles, in the mouth of Zacharias. Interesting is, the birth is 1 verse or 2, and the circumcision is a total capital, you could say, with this long canticle of Zacharias. When you go to Jesus, the birth is 20 verses. and the circumcision is only one verse. 7 days later, as is the rule and the law. And you see the symmetry. Birth, circumcision, birth, circumcision. But short birth and long circumcision, and on the other side, long narrative of the birth and a short one of the circumcision. There is symmetry and antithesis. Now, if we go to the gospel of Christmas, the gospel of the birth of Jesus according to Luke, as I told you, it is 20 verses, but we never get these 20 verses together. And we miss again the point. The point is again that Luke will tell the story with two elements, two starting points. We start first when they arrive at Bethlehem, the parents with the coming child, a bit outside of Bethlehem, they find a place and they can put the child in some sheets and with a crib. Yeah. Let me look carefully to say the exact terms. They will be repeated twice in the story. She wrapped the child in swaddling clothes and let him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the living space. That is the first happening. With the camera of Luke, we see even these humble details. No place for them, and only wrapped in clothes and pushed in a manger. And now the contrast. In the countryside, there were shepherds in vigil with their sheep, and an angel appeared to them, as there was an angel to Mary and an angel to Zacharias. And he announced the birth of a child. And suddenly the heaven goes open and choirs are singing the famous Gloria in excelsis Deo. The Gloria that we all know by heart comes from Luke and from the poor shepherds. And they receive the message that in Bethlehem a child is born. And they decide then, and you see again, the two moments will be brought together. And they go to Bethlehem, as they say to, let us go to Bethlehem and see what happened and see if it is true what is said. And what they see is exactly what has been announced. And they come with a complete message from heaven. For Mary and for Joseph and everybody who was there are surprised by the news that comes from heaven. And you see again the talent of Luke. He has started the story with two elements, and the third element arrives with the splendid confirmation of who is that child in the city of David where it is born. So far, the center, two birds, two circumcisions, two names, and finally we see the relationship, as Zacharias himself has pronounced it, to boy, you will go before the other, who is the real visualization of the mercy, the loving kindness of our God in the highest.